All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that I think a lot of people have probably wondered about at some point.
Okay.
How much do our spatial skills, like being good at puzzles or picturing things in your head, how much does that actually connect to how good we are at math?
Yeah, it's one of those things that just seems so intuitive.
Right.
And it's definitely been a hot topic for researchers for a long time. So I think for this deep dive, we've got a pretty hefty amount of research to dig into, but at its heart, there's a really comprehensive review of all the existing research on this topic. It's called a meta-analysis, which is basically a study of studies.
I love a meta-analysis.
Yeah, you get the big picture.
Big picture, all the data.
Exactly. So this particular one pulled together a massive 73 different studies, and that gave us, get this, 263 different sets of findings to work with. So, our goal today isn't just to give a quick yes or no answer to this question,
Right.
but to really get into the complexities and the nuances of this relationship based on, a really broad and thorough look at what's actually been studied.
Absolutely, because when you start to think about it, both spatial ability and mathematical ability are pretty broad terms.
Yeah.
And this study actually breaks both of those down into a bunch of different categories.
Right.
So it gets really specific. On the spatial side, they looked at everything from being able to mentally rotate objects in your mind,
Right.
which they call intrinsic dynamic,
Hmm.
to just being able to make sense of where things are in the world around you,
Right.
which is extrinsic static,
Right.
and even how good your visual memory is for spatial stuff.
Yeah.
And then on the math side, they looked at basic number sense, arithmetic, geometry, and even logical problem solving. So we're not just talking about a general hunch here. We're going to see where the specific connections are strongest and maybe where they're surprisingly not so strong.
Exactly. So let's jump right into the million-dollar question. Is there an overall link between being good spatially and being good at math? And what this giant chunk of research tells us is, in essence, yes. There is a significant positive association.
Okay.
However, and this is a big however,
Yeah.
it's not a, simple, consistent, one-size-fits-all link.
Okay.
Across every single study, the strength of that connection, what researchers call the correlation coefficient, it jumps around quite a bit.
Interesting.
So from as low as -0.61 all the way up to plus 0.61,
Wow.
which is a huge range.
That's a big swing.
It is. And I think that massive range really underscores that, it's not a straightforward yes or no situation.
Right.
Sometimes that link is really strong, sometimes it's weak, sometimes it even seems to go in opposite directions, depending on what specific skills are being measured.
Yeah, and what could be driving that much variation in those findings? Because that's a lot.
It is a lot. So the researchers in this paper, they point to some evidence from other areas of study that generally seems to support a connection. For example, there have been some really interesting studies looking at identical and fraternal twins. And what those studies suggest is that, both spatial and math abilities are partly influenced by our genes. However, it's not like there's a math gene and a spatial gene. It seems like the specific genetic factors that influence those skills tend to overlap.
Okay.
And then if you look at the brain, we've got some pretty interesting stuff from neuropsychological studies. Those have actually found that there are some shared networks in the brain that seem to light up,
Okay.
both when we're doing spatial tasks and when we're doing mathematical problem solving.
Right.
So on a genetic level, on a neurological level, there seems to be some, shared machinery there.
Right.
But as you mentioned, some of those individual behavioral studies haven't always found a clear connection, which is why this meta-analysis, by looking at so many studies at once, is really valuable.
Right.
It helps us see the bigger picture
Yeah.
while also acknowledging that this isn't, always a clear-cut relationship in every single study.
It's not like if you're good at one, you're automatically good at the other.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so there is a connection there. It's just not a simple on-off switch. Let's dig a little deeper into these different flavors of spatial ability that you were talking about. So what are the main differences? And then how do those seem to connect to our overall math skills?
Sure. So the way that the researchers categorize spatial ability in this meta-analysis, it's actually a pretty standard way of thinking about it. They basically looked at whether the task that someone's doing involves the object itself or the surroundings of that object. So that's what they call intrinsic versus extrinsic.
Okay, got it.
And then they also looked at whether you're manipulating something mentally or just perceiving like a static arrangement of things. And that's
Right.
the dynamic versus static part.
Okay.
So when you combine those, you get these different categories.
Right.
So for example, intrinsic dynamic tasks. Those are all about mentally moving or transforming an object in your mind.
Okay.
Think about those mental rotation puzzles where you have to figure out, which of these shapes is the same as this one just rotated, or picturing how a folded piece of paper will look when you unfold it.
Right. I love those.
Yeah.
Those are fun.
So then you've got intrinsic static, which is more about recognizing those spatial patterns or relationships within an object or image, like those find the missing piece puzzles.
Okay, got it.
Then we move on to the extrinsic tasks, and those are the ones that involve how an object relates to its environment. So extrinsic dynamic would be like imagining how something would look from a different perspective.
Okay,
So, picture trying to describe to someone how your living room looks from the doorway.
got it.
Interestingly, that particular type of spatial ability, the extrinsic dynamic, that actually didn't show a significant link to math ability in this overall analysis. Yeah. Then you've got extrinsic static, which is all about understanding spatial relationships in the world around you. Things like reading a map
Yeah.
or knowing which way is north.
Okay.
And then, really importantly, they also looked at visual spatial memory as its own category. And that's simply how well you can remember visual and spatial information for short periods.
Right, like what you might hold in your mind's eye
Exactly.
as you're working on a problem or something.
Right.
Okay, so that's a really helpful breakdown of all the ways that we can be spatially smart.
Right.
Did any of these categories seem to have a stronger connection to math in general than others?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe a little bit surprising.
Okay.
So the meta-analysis actually found that those different types of spatial ability that we just talked about, so intrinsic dynamic, intrinsic static, extrinsic static, and visual spatial memory, they actually showed pretty similar overall connections to mathematical ability.
Mm.
Like the average strength of those connections, which is called the correlation or the R value, it ranged from about 0.19 for intrinsic static skills to around 0.31 for intrinsic dynamic skills. And all of those were statistically significant, which means that they weren't just due to random chance. Visual spatial memory was kind of right in the middle with an average correlation of about 0.26. And what's also really telling is that when you look at the range of likely values for those correlations, what we call the confidence intervals, they actually overlapped quite a bit.
Okay.
Which suggests that, broadly speaking, these different spatial skills, they're all connected to math ability to a fairly similar degree.
Yeah, which maybe goes against what you would intuitively think.
Yeah, you would think, right? Like
Yeah.
you'd expect, being able to mentally rotate shapes to be much more closely tied to geometry than, being good at reading a map.
Right.
But that's not necessarily what they found. However, the researchers did take a closer look at this, and they found that the specific type of spatial ability did matter more when they zoomed in on particular areas of math ability.
Okay.
So, for instance, when they looked specifically at arithmetical ability, they found a stronger link to visual spatial memory compared to those, mental rotation skills, the intrinsic dynamic ones.
Okay.
But when it came to numerical ability, geometry, and logical reasoning, the different types of spatial ability didn't show any real differences in how strong those connections were. So it seems like, the specific flavor of math that you're doing
Yeah.
might interact a little bit differently with the specific flavor of your spatial skills.
Okay, so while all the different spatial skills have a pretty similar link to math in general, if you zoom in, like if you look at something really specific like arithmetic, being able to hold and manipulate visual information in your mind seems to be more important than just being able to mentally twist objects.
Right.
Okay, let's flip the script a little bit here. We've talked about the different kinds of spatial ability. What about the different areas of mathematical ability?
Right. So just like spatial ability isn't one single thing,
Yeah.
mathematical ability also isn't. So in this meta-analysis, the researchers broke down mathematical ability into 4 main areas. So first, you've got numerical ability, which is basically your understanding of what numbers mean,
Okay.
being able to represent them, compare them, and count. And then you've got arithmetical ability, which is all about doing operations with numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and even some of the more complex stuff like algebra and calculus.
Okay.
And then third, there's geometric ability, which deals with shapes, angles, and spatial relationships in a more kind of formal, abstract way.
Got it.
And then finally, there's logical reasoning, which involves things like comparing information, finding patterns, making generalizations, using deduction, and analyzing mathematical concepts.
Okay.
And this often comes into play, when you're tackling things like word problems.
So did the researchers find that spatial ability connects to all of these areas of math in the same way?
No, this is where they found a really significant difference. So the specific area of math that you're talking about really did change how strong that connection to spatial ability was. So they did find significant positive links across the board. Spatial ability was connected to numerical ability, arithmetical ability, geometric ability, and logical reasoning.
But the strength of those connections varied.
Exactly. Yeah, they varied quite noticeably.
And where was that connection strongest?
Well, the most striking finding was that logical reasoning showed a significantly stronger connection with spatial ability compared to both numerical and arithmetical abilities. And the statistical analysis that they did, which is called a meta-regression, really confirmed this. It was a significant result. So this suggests that when math problems require more abstract thought, when you need to mentally visualize scenarios and work through those logical steps, that's really where spatial skills become particularly important.
Which makes sense when you think about trying to solve a complex word problem.
Right.
You have to picture the situation in your mind and figure out the logical steps to get to an answer. So what were their thoughts on why logical reasoning might have this kind of extra strong connection?
Well, they point to a couple of key factors. So one is the higher level of complexity involved in logical reasoning tasks. They often require those more abstract processes like inductive and deductive thinking, and also the ability to mentally transform information and visualize all these different possibilities.
Right.
And then the other factor that they considered was the different ways that we engage with these tasks. So logical reasoning problems, they often involve, not just numbers, but also words and those visual or spatial elements.
Okay.
So you're really having to integrate all of those different kinds of information, whereas numerical and arithmetical tasks tend to rely more heavily on just understanding and manipulating numbers themselves.
Okay, that's a really insightful point about how we engage with different types of math problems. And it makes me think about geometry, which you would think would have a very obvious visual and spatial component.
Right.
So did their research bear that out?
Yeah, so geometric ability, as you might expect, did show a strong connection with spatial ability, which, isn't too surprising given that it's all about shapes and their spatial relationships. But somewhat unexpectedly, the strength of this connection wasn't significantly different from what they found for numerical or arithmetical abilities.
Oh, well, that is a bit surprising considering how visual geometry seems.
Yeah.
How do they try to explain that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So they suggested that even though basic number skills and arithmetic might seem less special on the surface, numbers themselves actually have a kind of spatial organization in our minds.
Really?
Yeah, and there's something that researchers have discovered called the Spatial Numerical Association of Response Code, or Esner-Arc effect. And basically what that means is that we tend to, mentally represent smaller numbers on the left and larger numbers on the right. So even just thinking about numbers has this kind of spatial element to it. And then also when you think about doing arithmetic, especially more complex problems, it often involves these spatial elements like the layout of equations and the manipulation of symbols on a page or even just in your head.
Right.
Think about solving an algebra problem. You're physically or mentally moving terms around. So while geometry is clearly spatial, there might be more underlying spatial elements in other areas of math than we realize.
It's so fascinating how interconnected our different cognitive abilities are.
It really is.
Now, the study also looked at whether things like age and developmental stage play a role in this relationship between spatial and math skills. What did they find there?
Yeah, so they investigated whether this overall link between spatial and mathematical ability changed as people got older. So looking at children, adolescents, and adults. And interestingly, their analysis showed that age did not significantly change the overall strength of that connection. They did mention that they had fewer studies that looked specifically at adults, so the statistical power for that age group was a little bit lower. But the main takeaway was that the fundamental relationship didn't seem to change drastically across those age ranges.
That's interesting. I would have thought that, as kids develop more advanced math skills, their use of spatial reasoning would kind of evolve too.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility, right?
Yeah.
Maybe younger children rely more on visual aids and concrete examples, but the data that they analyzed in this meta-analysis didn't really support a major change in the overall correlation with age.
Huh. And did they look at individuals with developmental disabilities at all?
They did, and that was actually a really interesting part of the study. So they looked at whether someone's developmental status, comparing individuals who are typically developing with those who have developmental disabilities, whether that made a difference. And again, they found no significant difference in the strength of the relationship between spatial and math abilities. The average correlations were significant for both groups, and statistically, they were very comparable.
And do they have any ideas about why that relationship might hold relatively steady, even for people with developmental disabilities?
Yeah, so they speculated that individuals with developmental disabilities might also tend to rely more on those visual and hands-on strategies when they're tackling math problems, perhaps even as a way to compensate for some of the other cognitive challenges that they might be facing.
Okay.
They also suggested that the different ways that these groups are taught and the different cognitive strengths that they develop over time, that those things could also contribute to a sort of similar overall relationship between those two sets of abilities.
Okay. This is all so incredibly thought-provoking. So, what are some of the practical implications of these findings?
Yeah, well, I think there are some really important takeaways for educators, for parents, for, really anyone who's interested in supporting mathematical learning.
Right.
So firstly, when we think about training spatial abilities, the study suggests that we shouldn't just focus on those intrinsic dynamic skills like mental rotation.
Right, which has often been the focus.
Right, it's kind of gotten a lot of attention. But since different types of spatial abilities seem to be similarly connected to math skills overall, we should probably aim for a more well-rounded approach
Okay.
that targets a broader range of spatial abilities.
So instead of just those mental rotation tasks, we should also be doing things like map reading exercises and activities that boost visual spatial memory.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So it sounds like we really need to think outside the box when we talk about spatial training. What about the fact that this connection seems to hold true across different ages?
Right, so that finding that there was this consistent link between spatial and math skills across childhood and adolescence, that really reinforces the idea that incorporating spatial activities can be really beneficial for supporting mathematical learning at various stages of development. So for younger kids, this could mean doing more hands-on real-world activities like paper folding, building with blocks, playing with construction toys, things like that.
Those are great ideas. What about for older students?
For older students, maybe more structured learning that really integrates spatial visualization into math concepts could be very effective.
Okay, that's great to hear. So real concrete ideas for different age groups there. What about individuals with developmental disabilities?
Right, so for this group, the study really suggests that while training visual spatial working memory has been a pretty common approach, we might need to consider a wider range of spatial skill development. Activities that target those other spatial domains like block design tasks, paper folding, even mental rotation exercises, the kinds of things that are often used with, typically developing individuals, could also be valuable.
Okay.
And we really should be exploring those for their potential to support mathematical learning in that group as well.
Fantastic. And looking ahead, what are some of the big unanswered questions that future research might want to tackle?
Yeah, well, the researchers in this paper suggested that one really promising area for future investigation is to take a deeper dive into how the complexity of spatial tasks might influence their relationship with different aspects of mathematical ability. So their own findings, they showed that logical reasoning, which is kind of a more complex form of mathematical thinking, that had a stronger link to spatial skills. So it's possible that more challenging spatial tasks, the ones that involve processing more information, dealing with more interacting elements, or working with more complex visual input, those might have even stronger and more specific connections to different areas of mathematical ability.
So the research continues.
It always does.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. So let's really nail down the key insights for you, our listener.
Right.
So the relationship between spatial ability and mathematical ability, it's definitely real. It's important, but it's not this simple one-to-one connection. The specific kind of mathematical thinking that you're doing seems to matter a lot, and logical reasoning shows a particularly strong tie to spatial skills. And while the different ways of being spatially skilled seem to have fairly similar overall links to math, how these specific skills interact with those different areas of math is a lot more nuanced than we might have initially thought.
That's a perfect summary.
Thank you. And I think a crucial takeaway is that these findings really open up some exciting possibilities for how we can support mathematical learning. by intentionally developing a range of spatial skills
Yeah.
across different ages and for individuals with diverse learning profiles.
Absolutely.
So as you go about your day-to-day, I want you to think about this. Considering all of the different connections that we've explored, what specific spatial activities might you find most helpful in your own problem solving? And that doesn't even have to be a math problem, it could be anything.
Right.
Maybe trying to visualize a problem from a different angle, mentally manipulating the information that you have, or even just paying closer attention to the spatial relationships around you. Those might unlock some new ways of thinking and lead to those aha moments that we all love.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, it's been fun.
And we will see you next time.
See you then.